Okay, hello everybody. I am Roger Waldinger. I'm professor of sociology and director of the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. I am delighted to welcome you to today's session, which is part of a year-long series that we are organizing with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to mention that this winter, we have been alternating between our book talks and a series of emerging immigration scholars workshops. This week, obviously, is a book talk. Next week is the workshop, and next week's workshop will focus on immigrant incorporation. We'll meet next Friday from 12 to 2 at the same place. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Milena Belloni from the University of Antwerp. So let me particularly thank Milena for being willing to be with us at 9 p.m. Antwerp time. And Milena will present her book, The Big Gamble, The Migration of Eritreans to Europe, published in 2019 by the University of California Press. We had originally been scheduled for a comment by Kelsey Norman at Rice University, but her internet capacity has been knocked out by events in Texas. So David Fitzgerald has kindly agreed to step in and will comment following Milena's talk. So Milena will present, comment by David, response by Milena, and then we will open up for questions. Please send me your questions either in the chat or by raising your hand. So without any further ado, Milena, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Roger, and also David for inviting me today. I'm really pleased and honored to be here with you today. Well, let me share my presentation with you. Okay. Do you know when people tell you you should not judge a book from its cover? Well, I hope that you will judge my book partly from its cover, at least. Not only because the painting entitled Sedet Exile by Ambassador Waldai is absolutely beautiful, at least in my perspective, but also because it conveys an important message that I also try to convey through my book. These biblical images of an exodus reinterpreted through the colors and the symbol of Eritrean culture show the challenges that hundreds of thousands of Eritreans face when they escape their country. You can see the pyramids, for instance, at the bottom of the painting that become skyscrapers, like hinting at the kind of African metropolis where a lot of Eritrean refugees end up being stuck. Or the small graves close to the sun, for instance, that tell the story of all the people that die during the journey. But there is more. These images show also how migration has gained an eschatological value for many Eritreans. What do I mean by eschatological? Reaching the promised land somehow, often a destination that is imagined to be somewhere in the US, Canada, or Northern Europe, means not only safety for Eritreans, but also prospects to study, to work, and to help their family members who they have left behind. This is the social, moral, and symbolic context of the big gamble of my book. Based on 2 years of research across four countries, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Italy, I tried to reconstruct the aspiration and the expectations of Eritreans who are ready to risk it all to reach their destination. But before delving into the core of the book, let me tell you how everything started. So it was 2008, and I was a 23-year-old anthropology student at the University of Siena. Due to the lack of asylum facilities in the country at the time, some asylum seekers had been sent to a touristic village not far away from the University of Siena. This one in the picture that you see is exactly that touristic village that became a reception center for a few months in the winter. I started to go there to that reception center, touristic village, together with a group of other students from the University of Siena to collect the stories of these asylum seekers. And I have to say that I didn't get much of my homework done in that time, but I became friends with many of these asylum seekers. Many of them were practically my age, and they mostly came from Eritrea. So since then, I became involved in the life of these young men, and I was witnessing their attempts to leave Italy to try to reach other destinations in Europe. Italy had provided them with the legal protection, a stable legal protection, but they felt that countries like Switzerland, Germany, Norway could provide better prospects for labor market and in terms of integration. So most of them tried over and over to reach these countries. And these migration attempts were, in my opinion, partly almost not understandable because as you may know, in Europe, there is a regulation that obliges asylum seekers to remain in the first country where they have landed. And their fingerprints are often taken and recorded in a biometric database. And because of that, even the people who try to move onwards from Italy are often resent back. So I became more and more interested to understand why do they want to waste so much time, energy, and sometimes even risk their lives? Because if we think about the crossing, for instance, to the UK, or even the crossing from Italy to France, why were they ready to risk so much to reach a destination which was likely to expel them again? I wanted to understand that part of the journey, but also the condition that led them to flee their country and the journey that they took before then. And in the idea that this kind of research would have helped me also to understand why after thousands of kilometers and years of journey, they still had such a high motivation to move onwards. And I was unsatisfied mostly with deterministic explanation of refugee movements and representation of refugees as victims, devoid of choice, devoid of desires, devoid of aspirations. And this is why I decided for between 2011 and 2014 to dedicate practically all of my time in trying to understand the journeys of these refugees. So between this 2011 and 2014, I was in. I visited the family homes of the people that I had met in Italy. I was in refugee camps in Ethiopia, and I was living in a neighborhood in Addis Ababa where there is a high concentration of Eritrean refugees. I was then living in Khartoum with a young mother, Eritrean mother, and her child, and I suddenly bumped into some smuggling operation while being there. This is just to tell you a bit the kind of stories that you will find in the book, the kind of protagonists, the people that really are at the heart of this book. Why Eritrea is such an important case? It's a significant case study because As most of refugee-producing countries today, is a country that has been experiencing chronic crisis. What does it mean? It means that people are not just escaping war. There is no war in, or there was no war in Eritrea, at least when I did my research. But people are escaping structural violence, the livelihood disruption, poverty. And these are the kinds of mixed factors, political, economic, and social, that characterize often the countries of origin of many refugees today. So it is an important context to understand how communities living in chronic crisis organize themselves and the role that migration plays in them. As I show throughout the book, telling the stories of those who want to leave but cannot, forced migration acquires here all another meaning. In fact, in Eritrea, while young people are forced to serve the nation for limited salaries without the possibility to become independent, have a family, or build a future, the desire to leave and the imaginaries of a new life in Europe or the US becomes widespread. Those who are immobile are those who don't have a choice in this context. So it's rather the idea of forced immobility rather than forced migration that works, that is suitable in such a context. Those who remain immobile, they do so because they don't have enough financial resources, because they don't have a family network in the diaspora that allows them, that would pay the journey, or sometimes also because they don't have the physical strength to face a very challenging journey like the one that expect them once they leave Eritrea. Also, the concept of forced immobility applies to those refugees whom I met in the camps in Tigray, or the people that I've met in Sudan, for instance. Ambassador Woldai, the painter of the cover of the book, in fact, still sits today in Tigray in a war zone after more than 10 years that he's left Eritrea. And again, the lack of choice applies somehow to many of my friends, those ones that I met in 2008 and wanted to leave Italy, but were systematically returned again and again back to Italy. For all of them, immobility was not so much a physical status, but rather a social and an existential one, as they remain dependent on family members abroad, and they are not often able to provide for their families who they're left behind. And in such a way, they remain in a kind of a state of perennial adolescence, and they don't reach that social recognition that has led them in the first place to leave the country, to leave Eritrea. So policy, socioeconomic constraints are crucial to understand why some people move and why some other people don't move. But aspirations are also crucial to understand why certain people are moving and others don't. Eritreans' aspiration for mobility are well rooted in a decade-long history of emigration, and they're continuously reproduced by transnational flows of information, money, and images that connect Eritreans in different parts of the world. This bundle of geographic imaginaries, aspirations, overlap with a shared morality, we could say. This shared morality assign a symbolic value, a strong value, not simply to the fact of emigrating, like concept like culture of migration would point to, but the value is specifically attached to certain destinations. That's why drawing on the studies of migration imaginaries, but also classic studies of the classic study of Lisa Malky, Purity and Exile. I talk about cosmologies of destination. Cosmologies of destinations. I use the plural to highlight that these are not by any means fixed set of representations or aspirations, but they can change according to the people, according to their background, their gender, their age. And this is partly what I try to illustrate in chapter 2 when I talked about the specific case of the Kunama ethnic group. While most Eritreans that I met throughout my research were ready to risk it all in order to move onwards from Ethiopia, from Sudan, and from Italy, the Kunamas instead had refused a resettlement opportunity to the US because they perceived Eritrea as their ultimate destination. So very differently from other Eritreans, mostly belonging to the Tigrinya group, the Kunama wanted to, their final destination was not ahead in Europe or in the US, but was instead back home, back in Eritrea. So again here, while someone chooses to stay, other chooses to move. The kind of the paradox of choice that I wanted to understand more while I started my journey was coming back and back to me. People were obliged to be immobile, but some others also chose to be immobile. Some people were forced to flee, certainly, but also some other people chose to move onwards in spite of the risk. Although the Eritreans I met in Ethiopia and in Sudan lived in extremely constrained circumstances where their freedom to move, work, and study was limited, certainly, their lives were not at risk at the time. Now, all another story considering the current war in Ethiopia. So anyway, at the time, the question was, why then would they embark into extremely dangerous journeys through the desert and the sea? Were they not aware of the risks that they were facing? So the answer to this question is clearly that, yes, they were aware of the risk. Why do I say clearly? Is because most of the people that I met in camps or even in Addis Abeba or in Khartoum, they had friends or family members that had died during the journey. And many others had suffered the consequences of a failed attempt themselves on their skin. Some were kidnapped in the Sinai trying to reach Israel, and then they were returned to camps. No matter these experiences, they are still motivated to move onwards. And the idea is the idea that has often been put forth in migration studies when talking about high risk migration is that perception of risk is relative, and people may prefer risking to die than facing the certainty of a social death back home. So the idea that exactly to live without a future, to live without the possibility of of having any social recognition by your community, by your family, to become independent. But there is more to it. There is an aspect that is often not very much considered in the study of high-risk migration, and that was very relevant when it came to the case of Eritrean migration that I was studying. That is to say that these journeys are made of repeated and sequential attempts. in a way, people were trying over and over at different stages of the migration process to move onwards. And at different stages, there were different risk and investment and losses at stake. This is how I started to think to what extent we could use a metaphor like the one of the gamble to understand the way in which refugees face migration, or migrants, not necessarily refugees. And what do these things have in common? Gambling and migration. Well, in my perspective, both involve chance, they involve risk, and involve investment. Individuals are willing to risk something in order to win, and there is also a systematic tendency to repeat these attempts. While I use this metaphor because it's useful, I think, to delve more into and understand more what people go through, as I will explain to you also right after this slide. It's also very important to consider and to say that gambling and high-risk migration are also very different, in the sense that completely different risks are at stake. Gamblers, they mostly bet their money, and refugees here, they bet their lives, if not of that one of their families and their communities, as the communities are very dependent on the remittances. However, this analogy, this metaphor of gambling and high-risk migration allows to understand why people that, in a way, had a choice, still felt compelled to move onwards and onwards. So in gambling studies, there is this notion, the notion of entrapment. And this notion refers to the condition of gamblers who feel obliged to continue betting, owing to the perception that they've gone too far to give up. What does it mean? It means that people feel obliged to bet again and again because they have already invested too much money in the case of the gamblers, but in the case of refugees, as we said, it's not just money, it's also energy, it's time, it's stress, it's affection, it's the loss of home. And it wouldn't make sense to have sacrificed all these things without being able actually to win. So without being able to get to the destination, to the place which would allow them to not only to reach their own safety, but also to provide the resources for survival of the family that has been left behind in Eritrea most of the time. So entrapment, I think, here is a key notion, not only to describe a state of mind, to describe what people used to tell me. This quote, "Get rich or die trying," you may recognize it. Is a song by 50 Cent, but it was also a sentence that was repeated to me by people who were in this condition, who were ready to risk it all in order to reach their desired destination. And it gives a good idea of what they were ready to do in order to exactly to reach the promised land, as we said at the beginning, to reach this the jackpot, if we want to use instead the gambling metaphor. And it's also interesting, I think, from a policy point of view, because it shows why these migration attempts are so resilient to policy obstacles like the Dublin regulation in Europe that I told you before, that implies that people have to remain in the first country where they arrive in Europe. And instead, my friends and my informants kept trying again and again, sometimes with success, actually. So in conclusion, why I think you should, it would be interesting to read this book. Well, first of all, it's open access, so that's a good thing for allowing everyone who's interested to read it. But I think it's the book tries to go beyond conventional explanation of forced migration and to try to explore what choice means for migrants that escape from chronic crisis and protracted displacement, a condition that, as the United Nations tell us, interests concerns more than 78% of the refugee population worldwide. It shows that while talking about forced migration, it's very important also to talk about this volitional, let's say, aspect of migration. That is to say, aspiration, desires, value, and to understand how these aspects do impact on their migration, not only in the first steps, so when they leave their country, but also how they keep motivating people while they're in the journey. I also think there is a potential for the gambling analogy to interpret high-risk migration, not only in the context of Eritrea, but also for other migration flows. There is a number of issues that I have not been able to cover in this presentation, such as the complex relationship between smugglers and clients, the role of families in secondary mobility in Europe, as well as the methodological challenges in conducting research in authoritarian settings. But I hope you will be able to read this in the book. Well, I thank you for your attention.
Okay, terrific. All right, so thank you so much, Milena. And why don't we give the floor over to David?
Yes, well, thanks very much, Milena and Roger. First, let me congratulate Milena, because this book just this week won the honorable mention from the Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Migration Studies section of the International Studies Association. So it's also a book that I've shared with my own graduate students in seminar. It's been getting a lot of attention for a good reason. So let me tell you why I think that's the case, and also invite Milena to elaborate some of the arguments here. Most work on migration decision-making looks simply at one part of a migration trajectory, a place of origin, of transit, of destination. But to understand migrant decision-making, these samples really are sampling on these studies are sampling on the dependent variable of migrants who've actually made that journey, and then they try to retrospectively recreate those decision-making processes. Or less commonly, you have studies that ask people in the place of origin why they have stayed or why they intend to go. But here we have a multi-sided project, and it is looking at this entire part of a potential trajectory. So we see that these push and pull factors are very much alive, they're dynamic. People are making decisions not as a one-time act, but rather as a very important sequence that's elaborated with a lot of ethnographic detail. There are a lot of studies of migration that are enamored of communication and transportation technologies that are asserted to change everything. Here, the transportation technologies are unremarkable. People are traveling across the Mediterranean in a motorized dinghy, or they're traveling by land in a bus, a truck, sometimes even walking. But the book does show that communication technologies really are shaping migration in some important ways. Not simply by tying migrants to their places of origin in a way that the transnationalism literature emphasizes, but by channeling social pressure on migrants to continue their journey onto other countries. The communications are ways that members of social networks try to influence and even control each other. Migrants are constantly being reminded about their family obligations back home, that there are greater opportunities further away, that the opportunity costs of staying wherever they are too high. And so the ethnographic account here pulls together this vision of a migration system that's evolving in real time. the book highlights the importance of gift giving, not just remittances, but material gifts. And in some heartbreaking scenes, the expectations of gifts on the part of those who stayed in Eritrea are often higher than what migrants are able to afford, which pushes them to take even more risks to try to get to more attractive destinations. So this discussion of gift giving is really a welcome intervention in the sociological literature, which has not paid a lot of attention to material gifts, maybe with the exception of the balikbayan boxes to the Philippines. The classical anthropological work, which has been much more interested in gift giving, talks about it as a way to generate status. And here this work is showing that sending gifts back home that are considered to be inadequate can actually reduce status. There's a risk of reducing status. And that's important because the migrants understand that. And so as we said, they feel compelled to keep moving to generate higher earnings and send better quality gifts back. So one question I have is, why don't migrants default on those gift giving obligations, given that gift giving itself is risky and it's competitive? It's judged against the most economically successful migrants who've made it all the way to the most promised lands in Canada or Sweden. And I wonder if part of that is if there are people who do default, but that the research method, which is trying to reach respondents and interviewees through social networks, is unable to access those who have simply fallen out of these social networks. So are there people who are part of a disconnected population that maybe you can't reach directly, but whom you could learn about by talking to other people in the broader Eritrean population? A key concept in the book is of this cosmology of destinations. And it's not simply a ranking of global South versus global North. There are rankings of different countries within Africa and within Europe and North America. While Italy is much loved by American tourists, Belloni's respondents rated it as a middling destination for achieving a dignified life as a racialized Eritrean asylum seeker compared to, say, Canada. So those in Italy want to keep moving. And it's this multiplicity of destinations within maybe not a universally, but a widely shared ranking that I think could invite us to rethink the economist Michael Puri's notion of a dual frame of reference in which immigrants evaluate their jobs and their status with regard to where they are from. And that enables them to withstand all kinds of difficult working conditions and host country discrimination, hostility. And by contrast, the second generation that's born in that host country doesn't have a frame of reference in the parents' country of origin, and therefore they're raising their socioeconomic expectations. So the situation that is described in this book, it's much more variegated than in Puri's account. So my question here is, what are the implications for understanding migrants' willingness to withstand a lack of prestige in work and discrimination and so forth when they have these multiple points of reference, not just two? And what are the frames of reference for Eritreans born and raised outside of Eritrea? Another major concept in the book, obviously, is the notion of taking a gamble. Gambling is a highly individualistic metaphor about taking on new risks, including the deadly crossings of the Sahara and the Mediterranean. And it seems to be in some tension with the implied household model in the book, which draws more, at least implicitly, from a new economics of labor migration perspective. The book does explicitly point out that households send some members abroad to help them support those who stay behind. It's a strategy to reduce the risk of having all of the household's productive assets in one basket if everyone were to stay put. So my question here is, to what extent are the households explicit about reducing these risks by placing members in more than one location? In other words, in all of these ethnographic moments of living with families, of talking with people, often in extended situations, are you able to actually see or hear people talk about this notion of collectively making these kinds of decisions? And are the risks of mobility assessed collectively as well when taking into account the risks of immobility? I also wonder if any movements beyond Italy, to say to Northern Europe, are they really that risky, since the refugee regime will return them to Italy, not refoul them to Eritrea? that's something of a safety net for gamblers. So yes, as we just heard, irregular crossings are against state policy, but they're also enabled by it. And I wonder if people would be willing to move beyond Italy in the absence of that non-refoulement net. The last question is, there is always a perennial question in these discussions of whether the people who are in an experience are refugees versus migrants. I highly recommend to you the methodological appendix, where she makes clear that she's a sociologist, not a refugee status determination officer or a lawyer, rejects for analytical purposes the refugee migrant distinction. I do wonder, though, if you could say something about the extent to which the interviewees see themselves or represent themselves as refugees. And if so, in what situations? Was there anything surprising about those self-understandings and those representations in that regard? I'll close just by signaling for the readers the richness of a couple of other topics that we didn't get a chance to get into yet. One of the long discussions is about how marriage affects marriage markets, how migration affects marriage markets back in Eritrea, and the idea of business marriages in particular. The methods chapter really is excellent. I recommend it certainly to any graduate students, but really to all of us working in this field, for its very candid reflections about a lot of the ethical quandaries as well as the methodological challenges of doing this kind of intensive multi-sided fieldwork. And I will conclude just by underscoring what Milena said, that this is an open access book. It's available as part of the University of California Press's Luminos series. That means that you can buy a hard copy if you wish, but you can also download the entire book for free as a PDF file. It's ideal for classroom adoption anywhere in the world. And I hope you'll learn from it as much as I did. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments.
Okay, thank you, David. That was a terrific comment. Okay, Milena, the floor is back to you.
Yes, thank you so much for this very deep and elaborated comments. So I will try my best to address all of them. Well, okay, first, absolutely, communication technology has an impact not only in the way people organize their journeys, but also very much in terms of family pressure. So the fact that family obligations are reminded through this, social media like Facebook and other kinds of social networks, or the phone. Even if I have to say that in Eritrea, there is no 3G, no 4G, and so except for, let's say, the main urban centers, people are somehow cut out of the internet. So phones remain the only way in which people can communicate, and often the network is not so good. So it's not so easy to be in touch. But even then, certainly phones and mobile phones and social media do play a part in putting pressure on migrants, and then for that matter, migrants also are ready to take even more risk to move onwards. Another thing that should be said also is that until recently, Ethiopia and Eritrea didn't have any communication, so it was not really possible to call, if you were a refugee in Ethiopia, to call Eritrea, or the other way around, because of the war between the two countries, or the no peace, no war situation between the two countries. But what I wanted to say is that interesting enough, it was not only the presence of communication, but also the absence of communication with family that pushed refugees to move onwards. Let me explain. Because people felt ashamed, many of my research participants in Italy that were not in a good position, good economic position, and could not send money back home, felt too ashamed to call home and say, how are you? Because as they told me many times, it's not only about keeping in touch, but we know that they are suffering, and we don't feel like just calling to say, how are you, and not being able actually to do anything for them. So actually many people had cut ties with home, and the fact of moving onwards was also somehow finalized to trying to get in touch again with the family back home, because at that point, once they were more settled in a country that would provide them with more labor market prospects, for instance, or some salary of they would have been able to get in touch again with their families. And that's a bit like the path that I saw among many people. However, also, as you pointed out, David, I think it makes sense that the people that are part of the network are more easily to be researched, while people that have disconnected themselves because they didn't want to comply with family social obligations are somehow cut out of the network and so less reachable. So that makes sense. At the same time, I mean, during my experience, I met, I heard many stories of interrupted networks. Let's say people that for a while fell apart because the expectations of the family were not fulfilled by even by the older generation of Eritrean migrants that arrived in Europe in the 70s or the 80s. But then afterwards they were reconnected, and then again they started to contribute to well, family survival back in Eritrea, but also financing the migration of nephews or nieces that were fleeing the country, for instance. So to what extent are families involved in deciding where people end? So here also it's much more complex, I would say, that what could seem from simply thinking that families get together and plan where their sons, where their children and daughters also would go in terms of like also trying to measure the opportunities and the prospects that this migration would lead to also for the family, because as it's kind of strange in the sense that there is a play of silence and of things that should be said and things that should not be said. So there is a general pressure for people to leave the country, and people and migrants are in a way considered, positively considered, and even represented as heroes in Eritrea, not only by the public discourse, but also in family histories, because they're the ones who were helping families in times of needs. So this is the general context. However, families would never push their sons and daughters to leave the country because they're very aware that as much as immobility is a huge risk, mobility is also a huge risk. People can end up in prison for many years if they're caught by the soldier crossing the border, and people can die on the journey. We know, families know very well these things, and so it's a kind of it's complex. It's not easy in the sense that there is not a rational easy explanation on how people planned. There is no direct planning done. At least that's what I have seen. Unless in some specific cases in which families actually decide to leave altogether because they have some specific prospects. But most of the time, it is an individual decision that is taken in a context that encourages migration to some extent, but is also very very conservative and very respectful towards parents, not to worry them, not to, as I mean, actually is very relatable for all of us, I would think. And definitely, I mean, as you were saying, David, the risks of migration at the beginning of the journey are much higher than the ones at the end of the journey. So for people that are in Italy and try to move onwards, yeah, the risks are not as high as when they're crossing the Mediterranean or when they're crossing the desert. At the same time, so they do not perceive those risks as high as the ones they have faced, certainly themselves. But in practice, they are actually very high risks because people really waste years and years, and this often leaves them in a condition of psychological stress, or actually it leaves them less resourceful than they were when they were in camps in Ethiopia, for instance, in terms of psychological resourcefulness. So as much as they do not perceive these risks as high risks, but these are very high risks at the end of the day, in the sense that they determine much of their life afterwards. So people who are actually, yeah, also there are these stories of people going mad, but yeah, it's a bit like that. I mean, there are a lot of there is a lot of psychological stress and related to actually being returned from these Northern European countries and not being able actually to fulfill the mission for which you have left Eritrea. And finally, the representation of how do people represent themselves as refugees? Yes, definitely. Eritreans have, my research participants in general tended to represent themselves as refugees, as people who, differently from voluntary migrants or economic migrants, had a real political reason to leave their country. So, and it was a very important, for instance, the way in which they present themselves when I was in camp. So and I was asking, yeah, why they were there, and it was very important also in Italy when they were trying to claim some social rights in Italy, for instance. So the fact that the Italian system would give them a legal protection, but then would not allow them to provide them with housing or a social stipend. This was seen as very unfair, because differently from other labor migrants or voluntary migrants or economic migrants, they were refugees, and for that they were needed to. They claimed a kind of different protection than others. So these are somehow the context in which I saw this, the claim of being refugees being stronger.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Milena, for the very complete reply. All right, as you can imagine, there are quite a few questions from the audience, so why don't I'll read them, and then we can deal with them one by one. So this first question is from Seyfullah Ozcourt. Thank you for this interesting and insightful presentation. You mentioned aspirations of migrants. What are the reasons, the major incentives for migrants who keep taking risks to continue their journeys? Secondly, isn't characterizing migrants as gamblers or talking about the compulsion for mobility problematic, especially in terms of the implications of this for policy, like trying to prevent people from taking risks deemed unreasonable, which could be easily used to legitimize imposition of state interests on mobility?
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, this is a question that comes to me very often, in the sense that the analogy between refugees and gamblers is often felt as problematic by people. Well, I think that, well, first of all, as I said, it's an analogy. And as I explained very clearly, it's a way to understand better a certain approach to migration, the reason why people keep trying. And I do think that there are structural similarities between the way in which gamblers repeatedly take risk and invest. But as I said, there are also very essential and fundamental differences, as I explain in my book, but I also explain in other publications. And the main differences, and I agree, I agree with you, Saifullah, are the stakes, what is at stake for these two groups of people. So as I said, on the one hand is mostly money, and on the other hand is their life, and also the condition at the outset of the bet, if we want to keep using these metaphors. So the idea that refugees take this choice already in a context of vulnerability, so in a context in which the choices available are already extremely limited and constrained, while gamblers, it could be the case also of gamblers, as there are a lot of sociological studies about the fact that gambling is connected also to poverty at the outset, for instance. But it's not necessarily the case for gamblers. So it's very important, let's say, to keep the differences and the similarities in mind. But I do think that the idea, this analogy, and the idea of entrapment allows to understand a lot in this kind of repeated and sequential high-risk migration.
Okay, terrific. Now a question from Natalie Bai. I'm very much looking forward to reading your book. Do I understand correctly that this book is a result of your PhD research and corresponding dissertation? If so, did you complete your PhD through publications or a monograph? If a monograph, is the book an adaptation of your dissertation? Could you comment on the process of publishing your PhD research as a book?
All right. Yes. Yes, it's the result of my PhD research. And I completed my PhD through a monograph. I've always had in mind that I wanted to write a book since I was a child, so it was a bit of my dream becoming true. And well, it was a very long and painful process. If you want me to comment on it, no, it was long in the sense that I finished my PhD in 2015, and the book saw the light in 2019. So after 4 years of research, I had other 4 years in which I spent trying to adapt the book, trying to adapt the thesis into a book.
Okay, terrific. A question from Federico Trudeau. How did your informants perceive you or interact with you when you conducted research in Italy, in contrast to when you were in East Africa? What were the main pros and cons of conducting research in your home country in contrast to East Africa?
Well, I think it's not only about geographic location, but it was about my specific position with this group of people since the start. And as I said, I was their friend before being a researcher. So this allowed me into a network of people that I wouldn't have accessed otherwise. I mean, because I was, let's say, part of their, I was like a trusted friend. Then they gave me contact. They hosted me at home. They gave me the contact of their families, even if the contact of the families were some people refused to give the contact of their families because they were not in touch with the families after several years, as I explained before. So it was more about my specific position with this group of people rather than the fact that I was in Italy or I was in Eritrea or in Ethiopia or in Sudan, because recently, I mean, I keep doing research, and I also went back, for instance, to Rome to do research with refugees, but with Eritrean refugees, but the people that my friends, let's say, have mostly left the country. So now I have a completely different position towards them, and the kind of access that I get to information is much more limited. Yeah, I could go on and on about positionality, and but yeah, maybe.
A question from Jean Beeman. Thanks so much for your talk. I look forward to reading your book. I was wondering if you could speak to the connections between your book and work on the Black Mediterranean / Black Europe.
Maybe that's something that I will have to investigate in the future. I have not investigated enough the connection between my work and Black Mediterranean, Black Europe.
Okay, a question from Elizabeth Milliken. You mentioned, quote, popular images, quote, as part of what, hold on a second, as part of what creates the cosmologies of destination for migrants. Can you talk more about what you mean by popular images and the impact of media and internet on the conception of the value of certain destinations over others?
Yeah. Well, also as we've discussed before, especially among urbanized youth in Eritrea, images that are diffused through Facebook and other social media are an important part of how this imaginaries of life outside Eritrea is. So certainly, yeah, even images of modernity, so skyscrapers and swimming pools and flashy cars are all ingredients of this kind of imagination. But as I've said before, also to David, it's also, yeah, not everyone has access to the internet in Eritrea, and so many people are just cut out of it. But what is important is also that the kind of media that are accessed in Eritrea are very varied. So also in terms of TV, for instance, they have TV coming from Saudi Arabia, from the Emirates, from Europe, from the US. So it was quite impressive to see how people were updated on the latest news, actually more updated than the average Italian person, probably, because they had such a wide range of access to the wide range of media sources. And it was funny enough that people, when I arrived in Eritrea at the beginning, they were telling me, we've heard that there is a very bad economic crisis in Italy. So how are you doing? How you're coping with it? And so they were very aware, and definitely these images from the media have a very important role in shaping imaginaries and partly also the cosmologies of destination, even if as I try to explain in the book, the cosmology of destination, in my idea, at least in my elaboration, is not only an imaginary, but is also a morality. So, and it's made of norms that are rooted in history, and so they are not so easily. Let's say the cosmologies of several cosmologies of destination are affected by this kind of cultural diffusion mechanism through the media, but they're also very much rooted in the past and the symbolic history of the country.
Okay, thank you. A question from Ted Cupper. Like others here, I'm intrigued by the metaphor of gambling and the idea of entrapment or the sunk cost fallacy. Oftentimes, gamblers continue to take big risks even after winning the quote big one. Was this mentality present in any of the Eritrean refugees who did ultimately make it to the UK or France or Canada? Did they exhibit a stronger proclivity to take other risks in life as well?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, no, I would say no, that the people that I know that have reached Canada, that is somehow the highest possible destination in their imaginary, have somehow stayed there. But there are studies, for instance, of Somali migrants that reach the northern Europe, so Denmark or Sweden and Norway, and then they shift again to the UK because of family networks, or because, I mean, some scholars also argue that there is a kind of culture of migration again that influences their ongoing desire to be on the move. But yeah, it would be very interesting to actually pursue this question further. So thank you, Ted, for asking.
Okay, a question from Misna Akbar. Considering the current international asylum system is designed in a way that ultimately disregards the agency and aspirations of migrants in choosing their final destination, what do you hope for with respect to policy reform? Or, in your opinion, is asylum policy reform unlikely to shift the response and behavior of migrants from Eritrea, considering the overarching power of imaginaries and aspirations?
Yeah, thank you, Misna, for this very important question. What do I hope for? Well, I certainly hope for a system that does take into account people's aspiration and people's social network, because well, the Dublin regulation, at least the one, I don't know, Misna, if you are aware of this regulation, is certainly a regulation that doesn't have has not been, let's say, successfully, did not lead to much success, not in terms of implementation, in the sense that people can keep being sent back to the first country of arrival in Europe, but they also keep moving back to the country where they want to go. So in this way, like, it's a waste of resources, even from a policy making point of view. And also because it has a very high human cost on the people, as I said before. As much as Italy or Greece or Spain, they're not comparable with Eritrea or countries where people are not safe, but still it implies a lot of stress to be sent back over and over. So I do hope for a reform of this Dublin regulation that would take into account the fact that people have contacts and have social resources, and they can count on these resources also in terms of integration. So they can count on uncles, they can count on cousins that have already settled in other countries in order to facilitate their adaptation into the new environment. And I think that just sticking to the idea of keeping people in the first country where they arrive is not successful. So nor for the refugees, nor for policy.
Okay, I would like to actually build on that question. And the question comes in two variants. I mean, one thing that strikes me in listening to your presentation is that the cosmologies of destinations, as understood by your respondents, seem to be very different from those of the Italians. I mean, after all, the GDP per capita in Italy is much lower than Sweden or Germany or Canada. So all of the Italians should be migrating. if they held the same cosmology of destination. So why is it that the Eritreans have a cosmology of destination that is so much more ambitious than those of the Italians? Now, or for that, the Spaniards or the Greeks. I mean, those countries should be emptying out, and all of those people can go, but they're staying in place. So how should we understand the disparity? And then the related question is, I mean, if you think about what would be a meaningful reform to European asylum policy, well, certainly part of the answer has got to be acceptance and resettlement all through the EU. That means Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland, all of those countries have to accept refugees. Everybody cannot go to Sweden. But if that's true, I mean, I can't imagine what could be another meaningful, sustainable asylum policy. But if that's true, doesn't that imply a significant tension between what is fair, obviously in an unjust world, unjust system, but what is a fair response to asylum seekers' search for safety and asylum seekers' own individual desire to find the best life that they can? It seems to me that the former has to override the latter, that asylum seekers they're not entitled to life in Sweden. They're entitled to life in a better, safer place than where they currently are, but not to life in Sweden.
Well, first I have to say that I'm in Antwerp, so I'm a migrant myself. As you see, the cosmology of destinations of Italians is also...
Okay, but the truth is Italians are emigrating less than they, quote, should. Economically, yes, they should be not.
Even if like a lot of young people are on the move, but I get your point. And well, there are two things. Well, definitely safety is the first thing that has to be guaranteed to asylum seeker, to refugees. But then there is also another point. I think that generally in discourses on asylum, refugees are always seen as a burden. So we think that Sweden cannot take all the refugees because they're a burden to the welfare state, or they're a burden to society, or they're a burden to social cohesion. But if we don't look at asylum seekers in this way, but we look at them as opportunities, we look at them as young people that are ready to invest and their lives, their energy into the labor market, and then this kind of discourse has lose a bit of significance, and also, in my idea, too much probably of asylum reception is based on state reception. What I'm saying is, if people were allowed, if asylum seekers were allowed to build on their social capital, and in the case of Eritreans, they have quite a strong social capital in the sense that they're well connected throughout Europe, throughout the world. They have strong family network, and they a bit like the sponsorship program that is present in Canada, and some family members, or rather friends, or no matter who, sponsor, take over some of the job of the state in receiving asylum seekers, receiving refugees. Then also part of this idea of Sweden cannot receive too many asylum seekers is also maybe not so important anymore. Maybe afterwards we can discuss about the problems that would lead to have too many people from one country in more cultural reasons for which asylum seekers wouldn't be ideal to have too many asylum seekers, too many Eritreans going to Sweden. But well, also it's not only Sweden. I mean, they're quite distributed across Europe and the world, I have to say. But yes, I mean, I think this is I mean, if I had some some power, probably, I would suggest that sponsorship programs and allowing for family unification to be a bit wider and more expanded could resolve a lot of problems in terms of asylum reception and also integration facilitation process.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have further questions from Katinka. The Eritrean government maintains that there are no refugee-related reasons for Eritreans to flee from the country. Are you concerned that your gambler analogy plays into the hands of both the Eritrean government and into the hands of European asylum countries who do not necessarily wish to continue to host Eritrean refugee populations and who may want to use your book to argue that Eritreans are not in fact refugees, but migrants?
Well, let's say that I cannot control people who do not read my book to use my book for their purposes. But if people read my book, it's very clear why people escape from Eritrea and the fact that there are structural, political, economic, social reasons for which life becomes unbearable there for many people, especially for the young generation. So I am not worried that my book will contribute to this in any way if people read it. If people don't read it, then there might be a problem. But if people read it, I think it's very clear, and I don't think the gambling analogy is any way related to yeah, it's maybe Sophia wants to answer. Anyway, yeah, I don't think that the gambling analogy is so much related with the factors that push people to migrate. The gambling analogy tries to explain why people keep migrating no matter the risks. So actually it says, look, they have such a high risks to migrate, but still they want to move onwards. It doesn't say anything about why people want to migrate in the first place. So I don't think that that it should be really a worry, let's say, if people read the book again.
Okay, a question from Jacob Thomas. I understand why you would not want to generate a quantitative measure of risk aversion, but since chance and probability are obviously at play, I was wondering whether you found qualitatively, in terms of heterogeneity among the migrants, how much risk they were willing to take in their venture, and how that might be related to their past life experiences.
Yeah, this is certainly this is a very good point. I mean, many people were willing to risk, but also many people that I've met were not willing to risk. And sometimes it depended on their it depended on their age, for instance. So certainly younger people tended to be more ready to take risks, and people who had just arrived and were still in the flow of arriving to the camps and moving onwards were more part of this flow of people who would risk. And then definitely you can also consider that many people actually among Eritreans had a military background. So let's say that the culture of tolerance, of risk tolerance, was already high and among these people. And even as I explained in the book, life itself in Eritrea, for those who do not comply with the national service, with the duty towards the state, is a continuous risk, in the sense that people live on the run, and they are always worried of being caught by soldiers and be sent to prison. So even then, yeah, there is, let's say, a past or a normalization of what risk is. So, but yeah, within this kind of context in which risk has become certainly very normalized, there are people that tend to risk more than others, and probably that's also depending on age and background. Yeah.
Okay, a question from Joe van der Spek. Hello from Amsterdam. Dear Milena, could you shed some light on the ways refugees organize their journey? Is this an individual endeavor, a family or clan thing, or are they usually totally dependent on the good or bad will of the people they encounter on their way?
Yes, this is actually very interesting in the sense that, so partly as I explained before, trying to address David's comment, the idea to move is usually an individual one. So even within a context in which migration is very much seen as a positive thing, migrants do take this choice alone, and often they do not even tell their parents and their family that they are leaving, in order not to make them worry. Or they often told me it's better that we don't make them worry, and we just tell them once we arrive safe at destination, if we arrive safe at destination. So that was often what the idea behind, especially the first step of the journey. So the step from Eritrea to Ethiopia or to Sudan, according to different people's journey. But what is very interesting is what happens in the, let's say, second part of the journey. So what happens when people are in Ethiopia or in Sudan and they want to arrive in Europe? Then it's like it's a very it shows very well the paradox of choice in this context of constrained mobility. Why? Because people often, young Eritreans that are sitting in camps, for instance, in Ethiopia, and have a relative in Europe or in the US, would try to ask for their financial support. But if this financial support is not, if people are not ready to give this financial support because not only because they don't have the money, but maybe because they don't want to facilitate a journey that can potentially lead to the death of a dear one, of a beloved one, of a family member, then they often arrange the journey with the smuggler, and somehow they give up their freedom in order to reach Libya. And Libya, at that point, the parents, not the parents, but the family members living in the diaspora are called and asked then to pay for the journey that has already been that has already passed, the journey before, and the journey that will take the migrant to Italy or to Europe. So to say, and then here it's like it's hard to say who is good, who is bad, and who is willing, who is forced. I mean, refugees are willingly taking the risk and even like giving up their freedom to be transported by smugglers. But also family members are forced to pay in spite of the fact that they think that it's not a good idea to move onwards. And then smugglers are there like to play the role of the bad, but they're part of a game that does not only involve smugglers but families and migrants too.
Okay, terrific. A question from Klaus Gomez-Stimmeter. How do Eritreans caught up in protracted displacement in countries that are not their destination of choice survive, considering their legal status is in limbo?
Yeah. Well, you know, in Ethiopia, well, Ethiopia and Sudan have very different legal provisions when it comes to refugees, and also different political and social context. And the life of Eritreans in Ethiopia and in Sudan is very different. And I'm not talking about the current situation, because yeah, in the current situation with the ongoing war in Tigray, there are many refugees that are just stuck in camp, and they don't have any assistance of anyone, and so that's a disaster. But when I was doing research in Ethiopia, there were several provisions that was called the out of camp policy. So Eritreans were allowed, some Eritreans with some kind of legal process going on, for example, a family reunification or sponsorship, or someone who had a relative anyway in another in a city in Ethiopia was allowed to leave the camp, and in fact many people survived quite well in Ethiopia. They managed to find jobs, they got married, yeah, and to some extent also in Sudan there is a very strong limitation to the freedom of movement of refugees that in theory should always be in camps, but as a matter of fact, Khartoum and Port Sudan have been populated by Eritreans and Ethiopians for decades, and they are active in the labor market. Also, they marry, they lead lives. So yeah, so they do survive, and some people survive even well. You would say they're doing trade or they set up their own business, but still in a context that can potentially shift very quickly, like now in Ethiopia. And,
Oh, okay, terrific. One last question from Seven Sagnik. What kind of gender dynamics have you observed in terms of gift giving and gambling?
Where is it? I don't see the question.
It's at it's towards the top of the list. Let me repeat it. What kind of gender dynamics have you observed in terms of gift giving and gambling?
Okay. Well, in terms of gift giving and gambling. Okay, well, I have to say, so high risk migration, so this very risky enterprise is mostly man's business, but it's also, there is also a significant amount of women that undertake this extremely risky and physically challenging journey. So even if the wide majority of the people that arrive by boat to Europe and to Italy are men, there is also a good amount of women. And well, there are also a lot of strategies, let's say, that connect women and men, in the sense strategies, and also just relationship that emerge in a context of crisis, in which also people try to escape, but they also fall in love, and they meet people that afterwards they are separated with for a long time because of exile, because of migration. So I also met several women and men that were in Ethiopia or Sudan, and were awaiting for a family visa to reach their partners that was already residing in Europe or again in the US or Canada. And at times these unions were well, the result of previous marriages, but at times they were also the result of somehow family solidarity. So the fact that the same family came from the same village, and people were trying to help each other to reach a more stable and safe place. And this is how many unions also emerged. Yeah, you said gender in gambling and in the
Right.
question, it was about gambling and?
Yes, I think you've answered it.
Okay, good.
Okay, all right. So that really brings us to the end of our session. I want to thank Milena for a terrific presentation and for such wonderful exchange with the audience. Thanks also to David for so stimulating a comment. I'd like to remind you all that we will meet again next week, same time, same place, but for a different type of session. This is the Emerging Immigration Scholars Workshop on integration, and we will meet from 12 to 2. Papers are available upon request. So without further ado, thanks to everyone and looking forward to seeing you next week. And thank you so much, Milena. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.